Okay, it's time for the last portion of Chapter 6. Now, we will talk about the other senses. So, as a review, we talked about wavelengths in the visual system. Light waves are how information travels through the eye and the parts of the eye we talked about to the rods and cones, which we called the photoreceptors. Those waves were transduced or changed from a physical stimulus of light wave into a neural signal by chemicals and action potentials. It went from the photoreceptors, the rods and cones, which in response to the light waves hitting them gave off a chemical. That chemical went to the bipolar cells, and they gave that information to the ganglion cells. The ganglion cells, in turn, received that information from the photoreceptors and sent the information down its axons, which left out of the blind spot of the eye or the retina and headed towards the thalamus. They crossed over at the optic chiasm. Remember, not all of them, about 85 to 90% of them. And then they synapsed in the thalamus. From the thalamus, which is our sorry, I had an itch. The thalamus is our relay station. It relayed the message and amplified it to the occipital lobe, specifically the visual cortex. For sound and audition, we have sound waves. Sound waves will not work in the eyes. They will only be converted in the ear. So it is very similar. We talked about wavelength and we talked about intensity of the wave. This is the same for the ears when they detect sound waves. So the short, faster waves create a higher pitch like the violin you see on the left, and the bigger wavelengths or longer wavelengths, bigger distance between the peaks, is going to create a slower wave and a lower sound like a bass or a cello to create a lower pitch. So whereas in the visual system, faster or shorter wavelengths was more of a blue or purple color, here we see it as a higher pitch. Lower or longer wavelengths is going to be a lower pitch. So it's very similar to the visual system, except we're talking about high and low sounds. Differences in the height or amplitude, like we saw in the visual system, are going to be louder or quieter, as opposed to brighter or more dull. So sound waves work by compressing and bending air molecules and expanding air molecules in the air, and those waves travel through the air. And if you ever wonder why your ear is shaped like the way it is on the outside, it's because your ears make a really in sound waves in the auditory system, we talk about the intensity or loudness of a sound wave. Sound is usually measured in decibels, so the higher the decibel level, you may have heard this term before, the louder the sound. The length or wavelength is the frequency, and that determines the pitch, whether the sound is higher or lower. Yeah, I'm not very good at the higher ones, sorry. I shouldn't apologize, but I do. So, as I just said, these sound waves are these bands of compressed and expanded air molecules that the ear detects the changes in the air molecules and it funnels them into your head through the ears. So we detect these changes in air pressure, and once they make it through our outer ear, then they go through the middle ear and then the inner ear where they're transduced or transformed, just like the visual system, into neural impulses. And just like the brain reads the frequency, wavelength, the intensity, all of those things for the visual system, it does the exact same thing for the auditory system. Only instead of going to the visual cortex, obviously, we go to the auditory cortex. So let me explain that a little further. We know that our sound waves vary in how loud they are, so that's your amplitude or height of the wave, and in your frequency or wavelength, which is the different high and low pitches. So here's the big picture. Sound waves strike the eardrum. They get funneled in through your outer ear, which is called the pinna, Pinna, and go in through your outer ear until they can't go any further and hit this structure. If you ever stuck a Q-tip into your ear and you stuck it in a little too far and you hit a membrane or you hit something where the Q-tip wouldn't go any farther, that's your tympanic membrane, also known as your eardrum. When sound waves hit a drum, and if you guys don't know how a drum works, how it makes it sound is that when you hit the head of the drum, it causes a vibration, and that vibration is what actually makes the sound. You have a higher sound from a snare drum and a lower sound from a bass drum. So once sound goes through your outer ear, it hits that eardrum and the sound wave begins to vibrate a little more, and it picks up the intensity. Tiny bones in the middle ear, your actual 3 tiniest bones are in the middle ear, and they pick up the vibrations, and they're called the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, or incus, malleus, and stapes, because again, we talk about their Latin names. So after it hits the eardrum, it starts to vibrate off of these 3 bones, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, and it gathers even more momentum and starts to vibrate even more, makes it nice and strong. Once they go through the bones of the middle ear, then they go through this little oval window into a structure called the inner ear, but it's also more specifically called the cochlea. The cochlea is actually a fluid-filled tube that basically wraps inside itself like a snail shell. And cochlea, as luck would have it, is Latin for snail shell. So, again, sound goes through the outer ear, the pinna. It vibrates off of the eardrum or tympanic membrane, picks up more vibrations and more momentum as it goes through the 3 bones of the middle ear, and then it goes into the inner ear or the cochlea. In the cochlea, the sound is now going to go through a fluid instead of through the air. So the inner ear, the cochlea canals are filled with fluid, and kind of like when you ride a jet ski, or if you've ever seen anyone ride a jet ski, you know that when they're riding on the water, it causes the water to ripple and causes a wake behind it. So now these sound waves have picked up a lot of momentum, and they're pretty strong vibrations. When they get into the inner ear, into the cochlea, they cause the fluid in the cells to displace, kind of like riding a jet ski. So when the fluid ripples and causes waves, it reaches the middle of the inner ear, and there are these cells that look like tiny little hairs sticking out of the bottom of the cochlea. These cells are called hair cells because that's what they look like under a microscope. So just like in the visual system, when we had the rods and cones were the receptor cells of the visual system because they were the ones that transformed the physical wave into a chemical. The hair cells on the inside of the cochlea in the inner ear are not actual hairs, they just look like hairs under a microscope. When the water and the waves hit the hair cells, it causes the hair cells to bend. And when the hair cells bend, that causes an action potential. So, just like in the visual system, where we had the ganglion cells forming the optic nerve by the axons coming together as a bundle, in the ear, once the hair cells bend, the hair cells combine together, the axons of the hair cells combine together and form what we call the auditory nerve that leaves out the ear and heads to the brain. So once again, axons from these cells transmit a signal go through, you guessed it, the thalamus, and instead of going like the optic nerve to the occipital lobe and the visual cortex, these axons go through the thalamus. That gets relayed to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, right above the ear. So the auditory cortex is located in the temporal lobe, and it's very similar to the visual system, as you can tell. For some reason, there we go. Whoops, my bad. Making sure that this is okay, good. I don't want to skip any slides. So here is what the diagram looks like. The outer ear, which we call the pinna, P-I-N-N-A, directs the sound waves. And again, that's why our ears are shaped like this, because it allows us to funnel the sounds right into our ears. From the outer ear, it goes through the outer auditory canal, and it hits the eardrum, or tympanic membrane. Once it goes through, and you can see in B down below, that's sort of a close-up of the middle ear, including the eardrum. So it hits off of the eardrum, and it starts to get bigger and stronger and increase the amount of intensity. And then it hits off of those three tiniest bones in the body: the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Once it goes through the stirrup, you can see on the top in the inner ear that it looks like a little snail shell, that inner ear cochlea. And down in B, where we zoomed in on the middle ear and a bit of the inner ear, if you start to unravel that cochlea, that's kind of what it looks like. So there's a little oval window, and once the sound wave goes through, past the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, it goes through the oval window and into the cochlea of the inner ear, and then it goes into the fluid of the canals, as you can see. Threaded in the canal on the bottom side are those hair cells. When the waves and the sound wave through the water hits the hair cells, it causes the hair cells to bend, and that causes an action potential because it goes past the threshold. The hair cells are the receptor cell of the auditory system, and they bend, causing the action potential to go down through the axons of the hair cells, which come together to form the auditory nerve. The auditory nerve then goes through the thalamus, the relay station, the amplifier, and it heads to, as you can see where the arrow is pointing, the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe. So it's very, very similar between the visual system that goes to the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, and the visual cortex, as it is for the auditory system, which is also waves that get converted to a brain signal, go through the thalamus, just like the visual system, only they go to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. When we're looking at hearing loss, and this is an interesting slide because it looks a little different than it does on my usual presentations, just the small print and all of that, that's very strange, but that's okay, you guys get it. That means that there are two types of hearing loss. In the last lecture, I told you guys that you can be blind if there is damage to the eyes themselves, or even if the eyes are perfectly fine, there could be damage to the neurons or axons that are going from the eye to the thalamus, or from the thalamus to the visual cortex. In this case, there's two types of hearing loss as well for deafness. The one that we talk about in psychology and in neuroscience is the sensory neural hearing loss, which is known as nerve deafness. So once the signal has already been converted by the hair cells into a neural signal that the brain can understand, any damage to those cells, to the hair cells, to the thalamus, to the auditory cortex, or to the auditory nerve that's taking the information there, can't make it to the brain. So if the signal doesn't make it to the brain, as I said earlier, we don't perceive anything. If the signal doesn't make it to the visual cortex, we won't see anything. If this sensory neural hearing loss happens and the signal doesn't make it to the auditory cortex, we will never be able to hear anything. So anything after, from the hair cells and towards the brain, is called sensory neural hearing loss. The second one is conduction hearing loss. That's if anything happens to any of the structures in the outer or middle or inner ear before it gets to the hair cells. So that would be damage to what we call the mechanical system that conducts sound waves. People have blown out their eardrums or tympanic membranes. You could have damage to the three smallest bones. They're called ossicles, by the way, Ossicles. So the ossicles are the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. If there's damage to those and the waves can't get through, then we have conduction hearing loss. Or if there's something wrong with the canals before you get to the hair cells, all of those would be conduction hearing loss. The great news is that sometimes you may have seen somebody wearing something that is a little bit more sophisticated or complex than a regular hearing aid. For conduction hearing loss, a lot of times a hearing aid may be a good way to try to combat age-related hearing loss and maybe some conduction. But for sensory neural, a simple hearing aid that amplifies the signal is not going to cut it. For sensory neural hearing loss, the problem seems to be that you can't convert the sound wave into a brain signal. So we use something called a cochlear implant, which actually threads into the cochlea. And if we can't get it to convert to an action potential and chemicals, then what the cochlear implant does is it stimulates the auditory nerve after reading the frequency and intensity of the sound waves. So basically, it converts the sound wave into an impulse if the hair cells can't do it, or if the auditory nerve is not working or is damaged. So the cochlear implant becomes a little computer or computing device that sends the signal through so it's not disconnected anymore. It's pretty cool. I remember when I first taught Psych 2 at ELAC about 5 or 6 years ago, and somebody told me that they saw a news article or a news piece where somebody wore a cochlear implant, and the child was 4 or 5 years old, this little girl, and her father, because he didn't want her to feel left out or made fun of or alone, he shaved his head and had a cochlear implant tattoo above his ear so that his daughter would never feel alone. And at the time, my son, Dr. C, was 2, and I was thinking, I'm not crying, you're crying, because I would have totally done the same thing for him. But his ears are just fine until I take him to too many concerts. So that'll be in the far off future. So, I guess all the slides are doing this. When we're looking at loudness, pitch, and location, much like color vision that we talked about in the visual system, in the auditory system, we have 2 different theories to talk about pitch perception. How we account for high and low pitches, as opposed to how we account for seeing all the colors. In this case, there is something called place theory. And place theory says that whatever pitch you hear, it depends on where in the cochlea that it hits. The hair cells are embedded, they're stuck in the bottom part of the cochlea called the basilar membrane. Basilar like base, the bottom. And so wherever the sound waves hit in the cochlea, they are transmitted to the auditory cortex in the same area. So it's going to correspond wherever it hits in the cochlea that it's going to hit in the auditory cortex. Now, this is a really good theory, but again, kind of like trichromatic theory, it's incomplete. So when you stimulate the higher ends of the basilar membrane, it's really easy to account for all the high pitches. But if anybody's ever played a piano, you know that the last bottom, 4 or 5 keys at the bottom kind of sound the same. So that part of the cochlea that has the lower sounds, it's really hard to differentiate between the different lower sounds. But it's really easy once you go up to explain the higher sounds. So place theory is really good at explaining higher pitches, but not for explaining lower pitches. We need another theory. Here comes the other theory. This one is called frequency theory. Sometimes it's called temporal theory. And frequency theory says that it's the number of action potentials or nerve impulses that travel up the auditory nerve, that the brain is literally counting them. And the impulses that travel up the auditory nerve match the frequency of the tone, and so the brain can understand what the pitch is. Now, this is really good for explaining all the lower pitches because it's kind of like RPM, rotations per minute, on a bike or in a car. You can really know the rotations per minute and tell the difference between the rotations per minute when it's a lower speed or a lower tone. But once you get over 1,000 RPM, everything pretty much looks the same, right? So that's the way that I sort of like to picture the frequency theory. So frequency theory is really good for detecting the lower pitches and is really bad at detecting medium and high pitches or frequencies. Place theory, on the other hand, sucks at detecting low pitches, but is really good at detecting the medium and high pitches. So, much like we talked about with color processing in the eyes, using the ganglion cells in the opponent process theory, using the RGB cones in the trichromatic theory, the best way to account for both high, low, and medium pitches is some combination of place and frequencies. So this is the best way to think of how we account for all pitches. So if you ever saw this in an exam or something like that, it would be a combination of place theory and frequency theory in hearing. So the last sort of information on the auditory system is how we actually locate sounds. One of the things that I didn't talk about for the visual system is the fact that we have both eyes that work, and what that allows us to do is see things from a little bit different camera angle, and it allows us to see things in 3 dimensions and be able to understand depth perception. If you only had one eye, like a pirate with an eye patch, your depth perception would not be very good. So, what does 2 ears benefit? Or how does 2 ears benefit us? Well, it actually allows us to understand where a sound is coming from, because if I'm speaking to you from your left side, and now you're picturing this, of course, and the sound wave is coming in through your left ear, guess what? It reaches the left ear first, and then it has to go over my head and into the other ear. So my head makes something that we call a sound shadow. As you can see from the graphic from the picture, somebody ringing a bell, and this would be in the right ear, so I guess I'm doing things the opposite. But if a bell is ringing in my right ear, then it's going to hit my right ear first, then it's going to have to go around or over my head and hit the left ear, which means that it's hitting the right ear first. Now, it would be really annoying if we didn't have something to compensate for this. So even though we hear things like a bell ringing from the right side, or me talking to you from the left side, we hear it seemingly, at least our brain corrects for it, inside our brain, because there are special cells inside this system called coincidence detectors. Like, oh, that's a coincidence. And what they do is they compensate for that lag between ears. So even though the bell will hit my right ear first, or me talking to you will hit your left ear first, when it goes to the brain, these cells called coincidence detectors flatten it out so that you hear things basically at the same time and you don't get like an echo, which would be really annoying. So our brain can compute the sound's location. Because the bell hits the right ear first, we look to our right because we know the sound is coming from the right. If I'm talking to you and I'm on your left side and it hits your left ear first, you know to look to the left to know where I am. If I'm talking right in front of you, guess what? Or right behind you, it's going to hit both ears at the same time, and we won't need to compensate for the time lag. And you pretty much know that I'm right in front of you or right behind you. This is how we are able to locate sound. Um, this is really good for things like ambulances, right? Because if you're driving and you hear the ambulance, you need to know what direction it's coming from. If you need to pull over, right, and you know that it's coming from behind you, you pull over to the side to let it go through. You know if it's coming from your right or left, that maybe it's not going to cross the street, maybe it's going straight, and you don't have to do anything. So it really helps us to understand where the sound is coming from. What about the other senses? Well, we're not going to go as in depth with the other senses because we wanted to really, or I wanted to really show you how similar the visual and auditory systems are. When we talk about the sense of touch, it's actually a mix of 4 different types of skin senses. Pressure or vibration, so that's feeling something actually touching you or feeling yourself actually touching and grabbing things. So you can feel different textures, you can use different amounts of pressure. Vibrations are usually detected by our skin senses. But of course, the other ones are temperature, so you can feel when things are really hot or really cold to the touch, like an ice cube or a hot stove. Hopefully you don't burn your hand like we talked about in chapter 2. We can also feel when the temperature changes outside because our skin feels it. We're cold because it gets a little chilly outside, or we're warm because it gets really hot outside. So it's not just warmth and cold of objects or things, it's the temperature outside as well. And of course, pain is also a part of the touch system. And although pain sucks, we don't like pain, it's our body's natural alarm system. So if, for those of you who may think that pain um, is unwanted, that's only partially true, because if you never had pain, and there are some people very rarely who are born without pain receptors, or there's no sensitivity to their pain receptors, they could break their leg and maybe be walking a little funny and not know that something was wrong because they couldn't detect pain. So although pain sucks, and I will admit that it does, some more than others, it is our body's natural alarm system, and so it is essential for our survival. So any other skin sensations that you can think? The only one that we, kind of put in this category, but we don't know quite as much about is like itchy, right? But that would also be part of the touch system, something that's itchy and makes you scratch. But any other skin sensation is a variation of these 4 basic ones: pressure/vibration, warmth, cold, and pain. How does this work? Well, let's just say that you are in your apartment or house and there's a thumbtack or one of those push pins that you may put stuff up on your walls like posters, and one is on the floor. As you can see from this picture, you step on it with your big toe, and that red path is the pain pathway that is going from your toe and your leg through to a section of spinal cord. Remember that your spinal cord helps to coordinate the messages from the body up to the brain and motor system back down to the body. So what we see here is that the pain of the sharp push pin from your toe is going into your spinal cord. Majority is crossing over, so if that is your right foot, it's going to go to the left side of the brain. And again, you guessed it, that it goes through the right, crosses over at the level of the spinal cord, majority of it, goes through the thalamus, and then, as we talked about in chapter 2, it goes to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. So these sensory receptors, called nociceptors, respond to the damaging stimuli by sending an impulse to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, it passes the message to the brain and interprets the signal as pain, kind of like we saw from that circuit in chapter 2 about the hot stove. In this case, you may pull your foot away from the push pin before the pain message gets there, just like with the hot stove. You don't have to worry about the sensory receptor for the touch system, where we don't need to get that specific. When we look at the sense of taste, taste is also made up of 5 different senses that come together to give us what we know as flavor and taste. So for these senses, we have 5 basic tastes. What we see is sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, which is meaty or proteiny. That one was the last one to come along, because when I was in elementary school, I'm not going to say how many years ago, it was the 4 main types of taste. But they've realized since then, and I guess it's been quite a while, so I can't hold on to the past, but that umami is the proteiny or meaty beans type of taste that helps to grow and repair tissues. So as you see on the left-hand side, it says, much like touch, taste involves several basic sensations. And it can be influenced by our learning, our expectations, and our perceptual biases. And yes, taste also has a survival function. As you have seen by now, this is how humans operate. Survival first, and then everything else after. So, how can taste have survival function? Well, this is what our body tells us. A lot of times, when we have a craving for something sweet or for something with a lot of carbs, like something bready, it means because bread and sweetness and glucose, sugars, convert to energy, and we need glucose and energy in our brain and throughout our body. So our energy source may be low. We, of course, store a bunch, but if we're running low on that from time to time, that's why we get a craving for something sweet or bready. That tells our body that we need more energy. We need to convert glucose to energy. Salty. I know that doctors say to stay away from too much salt, but having 0 salt or sodium in your diet is actually bad for your brain. When we talked about action potentials, and I didn't want to get too specific, but the main ion that causes a change in voltage, causes us to increase voltage, is actually sodium. So, sodium is essential to our physiological processes. It's what gets the action potential in motion and causes our communication between the brain and itself and the brain and the rest of the body. So if you are craving salty, like potato chips and things like that, craving salty things also may be our brain's way of telling us we need more sodium to make sure our cells are running normally. So there you go. So you can see the survival function in energy and in telling the neurons what to do and helping with action potentials. For sour, if you've ever tasted something that has gone bad, milk has gone sour, spoiled food has gone sour, it's our brain's way of telling us this is potentially toxic. Now, of course, we've sort of evolved, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, with those sour candies to understand that not everything sour is poisonous or toxic, but it is a way of letting our brain know that whatever we're eating may be spoiled. Bitter, which I'm very sensitive to, is potentially poisonous. So things like rat poison, things like chemicals under your sink that we always say that children shouldn't have. Things that are bitter are evolutionarily poisonous. I think I'm more in tune to that because a lot of vegetables that are bitter, even coffee, because coffee by itself has a very bitter taste, and I'm very sensitive to those things, so I don't eat most of those things or drink coffee. I know I'm a savage because it tells my brain it's potentially poisonous. But that's a good thing for survival, of course, if you do encounter a berry in the forest, like thinking about our ancestors, that's potentially poisonous. And umami is that sort of meaty, proteiny taste. So even people that are vegetarian can get it from things like beans because they contain proteins that help to grow and repair tissues. People that are on a protein-rich diet, right, it helps your muscles to grow. It helps your process, helps strengthen bones sometimes. I know that's, people think that that's calcium from milk. um, which it is calcium, but not necessarily from milk. So umami is that meaty taste. Sometimes people crave meat, and not to get um, too specific and too, um, I don't know what you want to call it, gross. But women, when they have their menstrual cycle during that time of the month, a lot of times because they're losing blood, they're losing iron, which is a nutrient that they need in their blood. And red meat has a lot of iron to it. So for those of you who are meat eaters, um, for those of you who are female, you may notice sometimes during that time of the month that you may crave steak or a burger or something, even if you don't normally eat it. And that may be your body's way of telling you we're losing too much iron in the blood. So we those are your 5 basic tastes, and that's how they can help with sort of survival function and guide the way that we eat. On the left, it also says they can be influenced by learning, expectations, perceptions, right? When you have something good or somebody tells you that it's really good, that can change your perception because you know, hear popular opinion and things like that. But also, there's something called learned taste aversion. If we were to eat something on a regular basis, and then one day we go to your neighborhood Chipotle, and something is, gives us food poisoning and makes us really sick, you may tend to stay away for a month or two, or you may avoid that Chipotle and go to one that's a little farther away. But you don't tend to just say, forget it altogether. However, if it's the first time you eat something and it causes you to be sick, then chances are you'll never eat it again. When I was 9 or 10 years old and I was watching a Dodger game, and it was the last year that they won the World Series, so you can do the math on that if you want. My parents had bought me a new flavor of Doritos, and I was in love with nacho cheese. This new flavor was called Cool Ranch, which has now been around, yes, very long time. So I was watching the Dodger game and not really paying attention, and I was a really small kid. So um, I ate and I ate as I was watching the Dodgers play, and we didn't have these little snack size bags. We had the big family size bag. Before I knew it, I had eaten about a third of the bag. And then all of a sudden, about an hour or two later, let's just say it all came back up. So to this day, I can't even look at Cool Ranch Doritos. And this is more than 30 years later. Um, and I can't do anything having to do with ranch. I don't even like blue cheese. Um, I don't know if that has anything to do with the ranch aspect, but that's what we call learned taste aversion. And some of you guys may have similar experiences the first time you tried something and it made you sick, and you'll never eat it again. So, how does taste work? Well, taste, we have little receptors in our tongue, and they're called taste buds. Inside each little bump on the top and sides of the tongue are about 200 taste buds. Each bud contains a pore with about 50 to 100 taste receptors. And remember, the receptor cell is the one that converts taste into a neural signal. So the chemical of the taste is converted in these little taste receptors within the taste bud. Each receptor reacts to the different types of food molecules, sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami, and sends messages to the brain. Yep, it goes through the thalamus and underneath the frontal lobe of the brain in an area we call the gustatory cortex. And that is amplified, the signal's amplified by the brain and the thalamus, and it's relayed to this area underneath the frontal lobe, kind of just above the nose. The last sense is the sense of smell. Remember, this is the only one that does not go through the thalamus. Here, just like the information from the taste buds that travels to an area between the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain on the underside, smell is adjacent to that. So taste and smell are basically decoded by the brain in the same area. They're right next to each other. And so that means they're both chemicals and they both interact. This is why if you have a cold or if you plug your nose while you're eating something, you may get the extreme sensations, the salty, that you can tell that it's sweet, that you can tell that it's bitter or sour, but you won't get the actual flavor that you're tasting. In your food, it's a combination of different flavors as well as the different smells. And those combinations are combined when you're sensing that. Um, so it registers in an area not far from sense of smell, which interacts with taste. So if you plug your nose when you're eating or drinking something, or if you have a cold, you'll notice you can't fully taste things. You can only taste or sense the extremes of that. So here we see with the olfactory system, which is the sense of smell, that the receptor cells are in the olfactory membrane. So when you're smelling, you get little molecules of odor that go into the nose. They bind to the receptors, and that changes them into a neural signal. They go up through the olfactory bulbs, is what it's called, and are sent to the gustatory cortex to combine with the taste receptors area of the brain. And I think, oops, that is it. So that is chapter 6. Now, I'm going to assign you guys an assignment, which I will also post later today, which is to come up with, I have 6 sort of activities. And what I would normally do in class is break you guys up into groups and give each one of those groups one of the 6 topics to answer questions for. What I'm going to do is put all 6 topics up on to an assignment page, and I'm going to let you guys turn in one of those categories. And then in about a week or so, I will post the answers to all 6 of these questions, and you guys will get your points for simply doing your best to answer these. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you very, very soon.